let's talk about the character of Garrett. Is he the same as he was before? Have you changed his personality?
No, but at the beginning, Garrett will tell you that the city changed and I have changed.
So Thief is very special because it stands out just by the title. It's about stealing stuff. It's not about, aggression. It's about how do you deal with situations.
Thief, the godfather of the stealth genre. As far back as 2009, whispers in the development world indicated that the revered Thief series, forefather of the stealth and subterfuge gameplay that inspired games like Dishonored, Hitman and Splinter Cell, would be revitalised. The Thief games were classics, a series that created a very specific, targeted style, manipulating shadows to hide your presence, paying close attention to auditory cues, and understanding that you were not an all-powerful brute, but an ordinary man with a club, a sword, and swift fingers. Thief was a series that exemplified the simple things, a series that forced players to pay attention and accept that they could not just stampede through an area, taking what they pleased and leaving a string of bodies in their wake. Even on normal mode, you can only take 3 or 4 hits from an average enemy before you keel over. Thief was a series that made sense. It placed you in the heart of enemy territory, tempted you with treasure and said, now find your own way. And thus, the godfather of stealth was born. Development on the Thief series ground to a halt after the release of Deadly Shadows back in 2004, a slightly awkward but ultimately rewarding addition to the series that was still very well received. It was the series' attempt to transition to next-gen graphics, and as a result suffered from a much more linear and compressed approach to its previously huge and sprawling maps. Still, it was a valiant effort, but its relatively low sales and conclusive ending brought the series to a natural finale. With original developer Looking Glass Studios liquidated in May 2000, the future was already bleak for the series, and ultimately, in 2005, Deadly Shadows developer Ironstorm met its end. Since the rights to the series still lay with Eidos, acquired by Square Enix in 2009, it was inevitable that a new game or a reboot of the series would be on the cards eventually, with the 2010s already well on their way to becoming reboot central for films and game series alike. This inevitability became a reality when, in 2013, just over 4 months after the release of Arcane Studios' Dishonored, Thief was officially unveiled. Now, I'm not about to accuse Square Enix of taking a gander at Arcane's successful stealth 'em up and throwing a bunch of hastily scribbled notes at their development team. I'm not about to, but it all seems a touch convenient that the particular tone and feel of the game, a dark, gritty, humourless story for the most adult of all the adults, is so similar. Hell, even the game's swoop mechanic is faintly reminiscent of Corvo's staple blink ability. I'm not going to barefacedly lie and say that Thief apes Dishonored in every conceivable way, given that Dishonored took plenty of inspiration from the Thief series. But it is certainly a possibility that the development team took a cue or two to help them on their way. And why shouldn't they? Dishonored was a huge success, lauded for its gameplay, level design and aesthetic, less so its story. It's appropriate then that Thief handled 3 of those 4 things almost as well. A phrase like that is pretty much certainly going to aggravate fans of the series, but to be clear, I'm not saying that the Thief reboot is a great game. It's a competent game in terms of its mechanics, neither here nor there on whether or not it can be objectively defined as good. It does enough to pacify, but it's hardly a satisfactory game. Rather than ramble on without structure, however, let me give a little background about my experience with the series first. I purchased the first two games, Thief Gold and The Metal Age, which came bundled on a double-sided disc, something that we're certainly never going to see again. About 14 years ago, after playing a demo of the first game I received from PC Gamer magazine. I've beaten both games exactly once, many years ago, and played both in fits and starts since then. My first experience with Deadly Shadows, the third game in the series, was about 3 years ago, and I only finished it this year in preparation for this video, for two reasons. It doesn't work very well on Windows 7 computers, and I own a Windows 7 computer. I did also purchase an Xbox version of the game, but if anybody who has played the Xbox version on the 360's emulator will be able to attest, it doesn't run very well on that either. I'm also going to be completely transparent. I am not very good at the Thief games. The reason is that I'm not especially patient and I'm not very tactical. I don't like waiting around for a guard to wander away before I slip into the room he was loitering beside. The problem is that these games demand patience, and as I said, this isn't something I have in droves. Even so, I enjoy the games and I appreciate the legacy they left behind, so when a brand new game was announced, I kept a close eye on the development, and when it was at last released, it was a day one purchase. Before I begin properly, let me outline how this video will pan out. The 4 features I mentioned earlier will be the 4 main facets of the game that I will focus on: gameplay, level and world design, aesthetics, and story. For specific markers, check the description. There's been a mystical fog in the gaming air over the past 10 to 12 years, a fog that seems to have blanketed itself across a huge variety of genres and subgenres, smothering the gaming industry in a homogenized, murky mess of quest markers, linear corridors, and increasingly expressive graphics, often hiding a shallow interior. Partly this is due to the unexpectedly enormous success of a certain video game series that paved the way for a good number of developers to trade time and energy in for yearly releases and innumerable patches. I won't lie and say that modern warfare caused an irrevocable shift towards a gaming culture of hand-holding, but there has certainly been a palpable change in the gaming landscape since the introduction of the 8th generation of consoles between 2005 and 2007. Increasing graphical fidelity, full 3D rendering, larger storage sizes, and back then unparalleled processing power inevitably meant that sacrifices would have to be made. It's a shame that the first casualty of the gaming war was depth. Thief is absolutely a victim of its own market. Far too much time was spent trying to make this game modern, complete with all the features typically expected of a modern game. Thief 4, the reboot that might as well have been the series' noose, spends far too much time gently guiding you around instead of letting you roam free and uncover secrets for yourself. You can turn off the HUD, the quest markers, but unlike previous iterations, the map is so unabashedly useless in most cases, especially in the main hub of the city, that you might well find yourself running in circles whether you have a quest marker or not. In the original games, you could indeed get lost for a good while, and part of the challenge was figuring out where you'd been and where you needed to go based on the visual and auditory clues and the hand-drawn maps Garrett created. But let's ignore that the previous games existed for now, I'll come back to them later. And let's take Thief as if it were a brand new IP. Even if that were the case, it would still be subpar at best, and that's being polite. And there are many reasons for that. Beginning with the basics, Thief is an action-adventure game with a heavy emphasis on stealth, hiding in the shadows and avoiding detection at all costs. Enemies can kill you with just a few hits, even on lower difficulties, and you have only the blackjack, a weighted club, and your bow to defend yourself. In combat, the blackjack takes several hits to take effect, but creeping up behind an enemy will allow you to either subdue them in one hit or initiate a takedown, both leading to the same end. Furthermore, a takedown can be initiated from above, playing a third-person animation during which you are still considered in-game, and can be seen and attacked by other enemies. Electing to engage in hostile activities against the enemy guards is largely unnecessary. For the most part, guards can be distracted with throwable objects, such as bottles and glasses, or avoided entirely, with enemy patrol routes scripted in a manner that encourages patience rather than all-out warfare. Similarly, the level design tends to favour nooks and crannies, with plenty of places to duck out of sight, cupboards to slip into should the need arise, along with the pleasing verticality to most areas that allow you to clamber up buildings and scout the path forward. Garrett, the player character, a grumpy and disgruntled master thief, is light and nimble. An effort has been made to make his movements reactionary. He feels very on the fly, so to speak, ready to spring at a moment's notice, and it's rare that controlling him feels cumbersome. More often than not, issues you may find with attempting to scale areas stems from the level geometry rather than any intrinsic issues with the character himself. There are many instances where Garrett won't climb something that he should have no issues with. These limiters can be frustrating and occur often enough that they can get in the way of escaping or reaching certain buildings or treasure. This is more of a problem in the central hub, where there are a specific set of paths to follow to each area that are very peculiar, and in most cases only one way of getting to any building, which can again lead to understandable irritation when a building that looks like it should be easy to get to actually requires you to navigate halfway around the area to find the only route up. Combat itself is appropriately clunky, whether by design or by accident, and use of the bow favours a standard modern-day reticule. In general though, combat is the last thing you want to be focusing on, and indeed engaging in it often feels tedious and frustrating, which I suppose is the point. You aren't meant to rain hell down upon the city's denizens, and attempting to do so is usually met with startlingly accurate force. Having said that, at times it's very difficult not to attract attention, and this is especially poignant when attempting to traverse the city. I'll discuss this further when I get to the map layout discussion, but it's tedious to say the least, and at times it's honestly worth taking a hit or two while sprinting through the city at top speed, just to get to the next mission that much faster. Thankfully, there is the aforementioned swoop mechanic, which sees you swiftly dash across a short distance from one shadow to another. This is extremely handy in situations where you're struggling to escape from enemies, allowing you to swing into a room and dash across to another, losing your pursuers in the process. It's also a handy tool for sweeping quickly across the rooftops, and whilst both it and sprinting are limited by your stamina, which by the way is an invisible bar, it's essentially a non-issue for the most part, as you won't need to do either for so long that Garrett runs out of breath. To assist in traversing the environment, and coping with enemies if need be, you have access to a variety of arrows. Blunt arrows to trigger mechanisms from afar, water arrows to douse flames, which guards can relight if they notice, although I don't believe I've ever actually seen a guard actively do this in all of my runs of this game. There are also fire arrows to do the opposite, or violently murder someone if you so desire, choke arrows to appropriately choke, rope arrows for extra traversal, and the sawhead, blast and broadhead arrows to commit mass murder if you fancy. You can also use flash bombs to blind your enemies for a fast escape, and fling bottles to create an auditory distraction and draw guards to a specific location, not that it works all that often. As you progress, you'll also unlock more items, such as a wrench and a pocket knife to assist in reaching the more worthwhile treasures. Whilst general investigation will uncover gold and silver cutlery, or coin pouches, and you have access to the lockpicks from the off, the additional tools that you can purchase will allow you to unlock extra paths to hidden areas, or remove precious paintings from their frames. Each treasure will automatically deposit a monetary bonus in your coffers once collected, and particularly noteworthy treasures will be displayed in your lair in the clock tower should you desire to check them out for additional lore. The money that you gather can be used to buy upgrades for Garrett's gear, allowing him to move faster and quieter, or improve your bow and blackjack damage. You can also purchase more tools, ammo, and grenades. And let me tell you something, you will be drowning in cash by about the halfway point of the game. It is incredibly easy to fully upgrade Garrett in an extremely short space of time. The final mechanic is introduced once you complete the tutorial mission and reach the city proper. Called Focus, it makes use of a supernatural element present within Garrett's eye that highlights useful items in the environment, to include treasure, and after a few upgrades, it can also be used to slow down time during particular actions, or show the inner workings of locks to make breaking them easier. At least that's what it's supposed to do, but in all honesty I found it far less hassle to just pick a lock in the normal way. Being able to see the insides doesn't really change all that much. All in all, the game feels satisfactory to play. It doesn't do anything particularly unique or exciting or indeed new, but then I can't imagine anything it could have done any differently. It would have been nice to have access to a sword, or at the very least something a little less useless than the blackjack, but that's by the by, and I can sort of understand why they did it. The focus mechanic feels largely unnecessary, a tacked-on function that reminds me of every survival vision, listening mode, pay attention really hard for a few seconds feature present in many action-adventure games released around the time. Still, in general the game plays pretty well. Garrett is responsive, and whilst the environment doesn't always present an adequate challenge or is unreasonably irritating to navigate, it never feels like you have insufficient ways of coping with a heist. So, in terms of strictly mechanical gameplay, Thief gets a plus, with a lot of caveats. We're starting off on the right foot, so are we starting as we mean to go on? Don't be absurd. So, let's go back to a point in time where we're not pretending that the original Thief games don't exist. Something that the series has always done well is huge, sprawling levels. Particular standouts that spring immediately to mind are the bank heists and forest levels in the Metal Age, or the Mechanist Cathedral in Thief Gold, and of course, Shalebridge in Deadly Shadows. It was extremely easy to get lost in the original games, as I've said before, but efforts were always made to mitigate this. The previously mentioned audio and visual cues, your ability to leave items as a trail of breadcrumbs, the fact that bodies did not despawn and could be used as grim markers of the path that you had taken through the level. What's important to note about the previous games is that there was always something else to see, there was always more to the levels. Each time you replay an area, it feels as though there's something new to find, something you can't quite believe you missed the first time around. New treasures and new secret rooms. The games are brimming with these neat little touches that greatly increase the replayability, and the ease with which you can traverse a level horizontally and vertically, unrestricted from the moment your boots touch the floor, makes them among the best designed levels in gaming. Returning to 2014's reboot, level design in Thief is a mixed bag, and that's being polite. At times it can certainly feel like faint echoes of its predecessors remain, with a particularly gnarled finger being pointed at the Moira Asylum as the inarguable standout level of the game, though not for the reasons that I listed above. The problems with almost all of Thief's levels are twofold. They're not very large, even if they can be somewhat complex, and they are filled, absolutely filled, with points of no return. In order to compare and contrast what Thief's levels do well and what they do not so well, there are two levels I'd like to draw attention to. These are the aforementioned Moira Asylum and the game's penultimate level, the Hidden City. It is said that fear of the unknown is amongst the most powerful, and I'm inclined to agree. I mentioned in my first impressions of top-down survival horror game Darkwood that the limited cone of vision serves to enhance this feeling, and that coupled with the game's atmosphere builds an intense and exhilarating sense of foreboding and dread. It's what you can't see that best emphasises this feeling. Distant sounds and visual anomalies are a simple but effective method of building atmosphere, and this is something that earlier Thief games understood. A prime example of this is the haunted cathedral in Thief Gold. You're thrown into a complex, twisting, ruined city and must use your wits, a threadbare map, and the audio cues of the music and the enemies to navigate. It's a simple but highly effective level that guides you slowly and gently through a haunting and memorable mission, with your efforts eventually rewarded by the titular grandiose cathedral, a huge, sprawling beast of a building that feels like the pinnacle of the immense mountain you've just scaled. It's very simple, but it's very effective. Moira Asylum is the 5th level in the Thief reboot. You begin with a boat ride, land upon a sparse, murky island, and are jump-scared through the front doors. There's very little to see or do outside the building other than a scant handful of treasures, and once you're through the doors, the entire building is open for you to magpie your way through, albeit with certain sections gated off until conditions are met. Finding an arbitrary piece of paper, for example, or finding out exactly where your young ward, whom we'll discuss later, is being kept. For an asylum, and for a Thief level in general, this building is small. I suspect it's actually the smallest level in the game. It consists of 3 floors, ground, first and basement, and has 2 wings, a male ward and a female ward, along with security checkpoints for each. There's a foyer, a cafeteria, and a basement containing several isolation and experimentation chambers, and the generator room. And that is it. That is quite literally all that comprises of this building. It sounds absolutely minuscule just reading it aloud, let alone actually walking through the place. Moira Asylum is far and away the most interesting mission in the game, with some of the oddest interactions, lore, and attempts at a dreary, brooding atmosphere in the series. But like much of the game, and especially the more interesting areas, no attempt is made to expand upon it. Thief is a series of moments, and you exist within those moments. Piece by piece you move from house to asylum to manor and back again, and never once do you really feel challenged to find something or to care. What baffles me about Moira Asylum is that it is abundantly clear that they were trying to allude to or show reverence for how beloved the Shalebridge Cradle is, but failed spectacularly in understanding what it is about the cradle that's so admired. Shalebridge is huge, complex and dingy, it's full of dark corners and is bursting with secrets. There are hints of the horrors that occurred there long before you even come across an enemy, and by the time you find the remnants of the former inmates, you can understand why this building is considered cursed. Every turn you take is exhilarating. You have no idea whether you're about to come across an enemy or not, an enemy who is horrifyingly resistant to damage, taking several explosives even on the easiest difficulty. What is most certain about the Cradle though, and what so hugely sets it apart from Moira Asylum, is that it knows what it's trying to be. It's subtle, layered and intricate. Questions rise and fall with each step that you take through it. Who is this kid? Should I trust her? I don't think that I trust her. What on earth is that? Where am I going? Shalebridge Cradle is more than competent. It is masterful. But for now, let's focus specifically upon Moira Asylum. Of the 8 or so levels in the game, Moira Asylum is easily the most memorable one by virtue of being vastly more interesting than the rest. The building has a history, one that you can slowly uncover by reading through the ledgers, finding notes from staff and patients alike, extrapolating from the ruptured walls and the upturned offices what may have happened prior to its closure. You can see the remnants of relationships, fragments of life scattered about you. It feels like it was once a living, breathing monument to madness, now left to decay, and it's up to you to understand why, if you feel like it. The blunt truth is that there's no substance to Thief's world or its characters. There's nothing that compels you to want to collect all of the notes or uncover the buried history of the asylum unless you're particularly invested in the statistics screen. You get nothing from it, and the cheap jump-scare-fueled nature of the surrounding building is enough to jade even the most laid-back of players. The reason you're there in the first place is to find out what happened to your young ward, Erin. More on her later. But the sad truth is that she is extremely difficult to care about. There's no build-up to her character, and the brief amount of time we do have to connect to her, she is rude, uncontrollable, irritating, brash, reckless, stupid, annoying, and utterly boring. She is every stereotypical I know better than you, daddy, daughter figure. So when her hubris gets her sort of but not really killed, it feels like a justifiable punishment. I don't want to delve into the characters too much right now, not that there's much to say about them anyway, but let's just say she is not a compelling reason to want to do anything other than rush to the end of the chapter just to get it over with. The tail end of the mission, once you're out of the asylum proper, takes place in a series of interconnected underground caves, and that is interconnected in the same way that a Call of Duty level is interconnected. You can go into that one room over there, but don't expect it to go anywhere since the other door is blocked by convenient rubble. There are enemies wandering around who are technically blind, and there can be cool moments where the AI works correctly and you can be within a hair's breadth of them completely still and they'll stroll right past you. Other times you'll swear to God you didn't move, but the entire building will go on alert when you're spotted by an eyeless beast halfway across the planet. The game is wildly inconsistent in this section in particular, and it's a sad fact that the enemies here have the most dedicated and decent AI in the entire game, which is not saying much. Still, it is relatively easy to swing around them, making liberal use of the swoop mechanic, and ultimately you are rewarded for your efforts by being turfed out of the property and finding the doors locked and boarded over, almost as if the entire thing never happened. This leads me into the second level that I want to talk about, the penultimate mission, the Hidden City. In terms of general scope, this is one of the most expansive levels of the game, but being large doesn't mean it's complex. There are faint echoes of Thief Gold's Break from Crag's Cleft prison mission in the way that it has you dealing with two different enemy factions, although calling them factions is being generous, but let's give the game the benefit of the doubt, and sends you through sprawling mines and dark, dingy caves that would be a bugger to navigate if it wasn't blindingly obvious where you needed to go. In general, this level is harmless. Unlike Moira Asylum, what I really want to talk about isn't so much the level's first 80%, which is relatively competent if a little uninspired. It's dark and dreary, there's too much light in all the wrong places, and the enemies are absurdly stupid. But rather, it's the final 5 to 10 minutes I want to discuss. Now, you can be forgiven for thinking that a game called Thief might be about some grizzled middle-aged man making a living stealing things to pay his rent. Well, more for you. Thief is actually about some sort of grizzled, ambiguously aged grumpy git who steals because it's his thing and spends his free time beating up old men. I wish that was a joke. There is a boss fight at the end of the Hidden City. It is the only one in the game, the only thing like it in the game, and it is, in a word, shit. It is one of the worst designed boss fights I have ever seen in my life, and I've played the Surge for Christ's sake. And the kicker is that if you want that no kills, no alarms bonus, you have to complete this boss fight without being spotted and without touching the boss. Have fun. It's a challenge, sure. It's an extremely out of place, bleak and irritating challenge that has very little build-up and no reason to exist. The easiest way to deal with it is to swoop from pillar to pillar and take potshots at the general's head. It is far less time-consuming and considerably less irritating than the alternative, which involves dipping in and out of the general's line of sight to turn some valves, pick some locks and walk out with your tail between your legs. All while hoping that the general doesn't fire an explosive potshot at you, despite not knowing where you are, killing you instantly. It is just not enjoyable.
The Heart of the Lion. So Thief is very special because it stands out just by the title. It's about stealing stuff. It's not about, aggression. It's about how do you deal with situations.
This is not what a Thief game should be. Disregarding the previous games entirely, this boss fight would be obnoxious, tedious and absurd even if this were the first game in the franchise. Let's take a moment to look at a few other stealth games. Splinter Cell, for example. You play a Black Ops government agent whose job it is to sneak into places and kill or horribly maim people. There are no boss fights, in the games that I played at least, because for the most part, as long as you've not been spotted and raised no alarms, you can simply pop a knockout shot into the boss's skull and sprint cheerfully away. In Metal Gear Solid, the boss fights have plenty of build-up and make full use of the game's mechanics for the most part, aside from looking cool and always having multiple ways to deal with them. In both these series, you know what you're getting into. You have a gun, a grenade, and your wits, amongst other things. You know you won't be able to avoid conflict entirely, but at least you know when the big bad drops by, it won't be an unfair fight. The Thief Taker general boss fight is extremely unfair. You are a fragile leaf of a man with no sword and no real surefire way of dealing reasonable amounts of damage, pitted against an enormous beefstick of a man whose extraordinary accuracy means he can kill you in one hit even if he doesn't know where you are. The instant you decide to face him with your puny bow, you are locked into a game of hither and thither, moving from here to there and everywhere, and praying to God you don't get clipped by an explosion. Up until this point, the game has gone out of its way to tell you to avoid conflict to the best of your ability. You are punished violently for trying to engage in combat. It is one of the very first things the game tells you, and indeed its opening chapter is all about chastising Eren for wanting to get too hands-on. The game is called Thief, but it throws everything it has told you out of the window for a rushed, wasted opportunity to get revenge on a terribly unlikable character just so the game can have a token boss fight. It is unnecessary, a waste of resources and an infuriating mess of a challenge. What bothers me about this chapter more so than anything else in this game is that Thief had the opportunity and the clout to be a great game. Its mechanics are refined, its look and feel is enjoyable enough and appropriately dark and brooding, with just enough levity to not feel too bland. It plays well, and learning patrol routes, finding secrets and uncovering artifacts is still just as enjoyable as it was before. but its insistence on adding in useless divergences like boss fights and jump scares and its heavily compressed point of no return based level design destroys what could have been a great experience. The hidden city was the final nail in the coffin of Thief, and sadly, that coffin has been well and truly buried. One of the things I do enjoy about this game is the simple fact that you can see Garrett's hands at all times. They are well animated, twitching and grasping when you're crouched and sneaking as if to yearn for the next piece of treasure to steal. Unfortunately, they're nothing new. Deadly Shadows was exactly the same, and it's odd that of all the things they chose to carry over into the reboot, it should be only the animation and stylization of Garrett, although the latter is perhaps a little too generous. Again, more on that later. It's also given a focal point in the art book, with the developers and designers indicating that this was one of the earliest decisions made and that it was important to them for immersion. Garrett's design is, let's be nice and call it acceptable. It's typical dark, Victorian-style garb, not dissimilar to Garrett's original design. There are belt buckles everywhere, hooks that seem to serve no purpose. It looks like it would be tremendously uncomfortable to move in, and given the sheer amount of metal attached to this person at any one time, I'm impressed Garrett manages to stay so quiet. In terms of actual physical appearance though, Garrett is incredibly rough-looking, ugly and unpleasant. Whereas the original character's appearance was primarily kept to shadowed cutscenes or hand-drawn art cards, he still oozed a charismatic charm and lovable snark, thanks in large part to his voice actor Stephen Russell. Thief's Garrett is apparently not the same character, something we'll get into during the relevant section. But whether he was intended to be or not, he lacks the definable attributes of the original trilogy's charming and witty anti-hero. The Garrett we have today is not an anti-hero. He's not lovable, and he's not humorous. He's tedious. Everything is too much trouble for him. Everything is a pain in the arse or too much work. He sounds so damn bored with everything that, to be perfectly honest, I'm impressed he manages to get out of bed in the morning. He speaks his lines with a dry, weary emptiness that is so one-note it's actually impressive. If I were to be charitable, the best way I could describe Garrett in this game is bland. But we're getting sidetracked. Back to the topic. Thief's setting and visuals are, relatively speaking, gorgeous, even if it does suffer from 30 Days of Night syndrome. But they are let down by having no room to breathe. There's so little life in the game, it's actually remarkable. Considering that Deadly Shadows had a fully fledged city hub as well, containing different patrol routes, new side quests depending on what night you were on, NPCs who would react to you appropriately depending on your previous actions, it's quite impressive that they didn't manage the same here with better hardware, almost 11 years later. Deadly Shadows was slick, smart, and more importantly, alive. The city of the reboot is not alive. It has fixed patrol routes to the city that don't change no matter what you do. It has the occasional side street that might lead you to a dead end or somebody's pantry where you can find candlesticks and cutlery. And it also has a small number of hidden extras that can be opened up as you progress and unlock various tools, like the wire cutters, the razor, which is used for stealing paintings, and so on. The city is lifeless, and I feel as though part of this is deliberate and part of it isn't. The deliberate part is a byproduct of something called the Gloom, a nebulous, all-encompassing term for we couldn't be bothered to animate more people. There is apparently a plague running rampant in the city, though you could be forgiven for thinking it was just a load of people with a slight sniffle, since no effort is made to either incorporate it into the story or really into the setting. We'll discuss the mechanics of the Gloom, or more appropriately, the lack thereof, during the story section, but in general it is a catch-all for the dark and dreary atmosphere ever present in the city, and the developers' cheap method of explaining why there are so few NPCs around the streets, or in their own homes. They're all sodding dead. The city's worst trait is how absurdly complicated the hub's level design is. The issue isn't so much that the layout is nonsensical, although there are aspects of it that are head-scratchers, like, for example, why do I have to go halfway around the city just to get to this one particular window, and why exactly are there so many different windows that require you to press the E button where others don't, and so on and so forth. Well, what ruins it is the fact that it is stuffed to bursting with loading screens and side streets that are little more than stopgaps between, you guessed it, loading screens. The city hub is no bigger than any of the main missions, but there are countless incidences of windows, walkways and doors that hide loading screens, but not all of them do. Some require you to mash a button in order to get through, others don't. There is no way to tell which of them do and which of them don't. It is completely ridiculous, and it's a crapshoot as to whether or not the window at the peak of a dead end is a portal to the loading dimension, or to some poor bugger's bedroom, or if the magic portal even goes to the part of the city that you need to be in. Navigating a hub should not be this tedious. And the daft thing is, there's no reason for it to be like this, especially not in the PC version of the game. You can't tell me that the hardware that was around in 2012 and 2013 couldn't create this city hub without needing 30,000 different loading screens. I'm no game designer, so maybe I'm talking out of my arse, but it just doesn't sound reasonable to me. And besides that, everything is dark. The city is in a state of perpetual midnight, and there is no real reason why. Presumably, we're supposed to assume one of two things, that the gloom has spread to the sky, or Garrett is a vampire. Now, don't get me wrong, I get it. I do. I get why it's dark. Garrett would have to be a bit of a dunce to go cavorting about in broad daylight. In the original games, a lot was done under cover of night and for obvious reasons, but levels were huge, varied, and oftentimes incredibly well lit, forcing patience in the player to learn the enemy movements or make tactical use of your various arrows. You were frequently out in the open, listening intently to the distant sounds of your enemies. And on occasion, there would be daylight. The opening area of the Crag's Cleft prison mission is outdoors, albeit briefly, and it is pretty sunny from what I remember. Thief seems to think that being street smart and an accomplished thief means that even one's grocery shopping must be done at midnight. It is a genuine shame that the city is so bleak, because the poor lighting and awkward design that makes my attempts at Tetris look pro detracts from what could have been truly fantastic scenery. Struggling to navigate even the simplest of areas is frustrating enough, and that's without the constant stopping and starting you have to endure with the enemy patrol routes. There aren't enough ways to avoid patrols, there aren't enough paths to navigate the city, so the easiest and least time-consuming way to navigate it without going 30 miles in the wrong direction is to hunker down in a corner, wait until the guard walks past, and then jog along on your merry way. It is an odd blessing then that the normal NPCs don't react to you unless you attack someone or swipe something. Levels typically don't fare any better. Although the game's graphical fidelity is inarguably an enormous leap in quality since the last entry in the series, it has lost a lot of somethings in the decade between releases, and two of those somethings are atmosphere and tone. The game wants you to believe that civil unrest and strife are going on throughout it, but nothing ever changes. The city sometimes has a slightly different guard in a slightly darker outfit patrolling, and on one occasion there's a bloke hanging from a building who disappears after the next mission. But that's it. There is a plague rampant, but there are barely any bodies in the streets. There's war between the civilians and the guards, but there are never any confrontations independent of what Garrett himself causes. One of the best examples of emergent gameplay in a reactionary hub is in Deadly Shadows. After the first mission, you can find 3 people not too far from your apartment, 2 mercenaries and an upper-class woman who seems mightily peeved about your recent theft. If you choose to engage them head-on, you can kill or knock them out and have done with it. Alternatively, you can hang around and wait for the men to discuss dicking her over, after which the woman will lure one of them to her back room and kill him. You can also get in the way of her attempted murder and let the mercenaries kill her themselves. Whatever you choose to do has small ramifications throughout the rest of the game, but they are there. No matter how minuscule the ripples, they continue for several nights. You'll see guards outside the house the woman was occupying discussing what had happened there. It's such a neat little touch that when I first played through the game, I reloaded the area about 4 times just to try out different things and test the reaction. And each time, I felt it was perfectly in line with Garrett's character. The original games perfectly balanced the snide, snarky Garrett, who always seemed to stumble into bigger troubles whether he wanted to or not, with the serious backdrop of a dystopic, hellish society surrounded by pompous pricks with too much power and trigger-happy guardsmen itching for a fight. His personality shone as witty and candid, in a city overrun with grim and grumpy men in robes, and particularly violent women with a habit of plucking out eyes. The atmosphere, aforementioned as a fantastic blend of ambient noise, monster cries, and the gentle scuff of your own footsteps against the cobblestones, all serve to exemplify Garrett's charm and talent. Garrett is a thief because he's good at it. He has rent to pay and treasure to plunder, and woe betide any nobleman who thinks a padlock will keep him safe. We'll talk about the new Garrett a little more in the next section, but needless to say, there is no feeling like this in the reboot. The city is just a city. Its denizens mindless drones, its houses lifeless, and its loot worthless. Although beautiful at times, and no more so than the very first pan across the rooftops that introduces the game, the only time there is actual light, every road is flat, every path is cumbersome, and every loading screen is a stark reminder that you're not playing a love letter to a beloved series, you're playing a crude facsimile. The greatest disservice performed by this game is the way it handles its characters and the series' rich, complex lore. Like the DMC reboot, the game's handling of its cast and their interactions with the world is at severe odds to the games that came before it. Prior to release, the developers stated that they had not changed Garrett's personality. But this is flagrantly not true. Take a look at these two simple clips. Listen to the way the voice actors portray the character, and tell me who strikes you as the more intriguing person.
I had some money to spare after disposing of the horn, so it seemed time to invest in some new tools. Farkas is one of the few merchants willing to risk selling to an independent like me, and his prices are steep. But the other choice is to let one of the so-called city wardens give me orders, and take a cut of my profits. They've been after me for years to join one of their stables, but I'm not interested. Maybe they'll get the idea and give up. More likely they'll just ramp up the threats. Nothing I can't handle if I'm careful. And lucky. And my luck seems to have finally turned for the better.
Let's see. This opening at the base, some sort of steam vent or exhaust shaft. It would be suicide to break in through there. That should buy me back the element of surprise. And what's this? The Baron's great safe. Rumored to be the size of a house and filled with gold. Rumored.
So, this isn't the Garrett we know and love. This isn't his world, his lore, or his home. It isn't his wit and cunning that keeps him in the game, his snarky comments, or his lust for the next hit that keeps getting him into trouble with angry tree women and overzealous lords. In fact, you'd be hard-pressed to understand exactly what Garrett's motivation in this game is. It's something to do with a girl and a city in turmoil, but you can be forgiven for blasting through this game without any real comprehension of what the story actually entails. This Garrett actively seeks out trouble. During the jailbreak mission, where Garrett breaks into a high-security prison belonging to the Thief-Taker General to free Basso the Fence, he chooses to chase after a mythical and apparently impregnable vault, not because he has rent to pay and people to upset, but because...
That's who I am.
Like much of the game, the greatest issue with this is that it avidly betrays the developers' fundamental misunderstanding of why the original trilogy was so highly regarded. There's a fantastic post on Eurogamer interviewing one of the original devs for the series. He talks about how hard they strive to make each guard and NPC feel like a living, breathing person, someone who had patrol routes but also had a personality instead of being just another door in the way of treasure. They talk about the way that Garrett and the player interact with the world in tandem to achieve one another's goals. If you don't want to risk grabbing that particular piece of loot, you don't have to. The games want you to balance wisdom and greed, and this is never more exemplar than in the bank heist mission in the Metal Age. But let's roll it back before this starts sounding like grumpy diatribe. Let me walk you through the story of the Thief reboot. Thief takes place several hundred years after the events of the original series. The city has undergone some impressive structural changes, and is readily being fleeced by a veteran filcher by the name of Garrett and his young ward Erin, a headstrong, impulsive and foolish young woman who does not give off the best impression. Garrett favours dark corners and as little damage as possible. Erin seems to revel in the chaos. In an effort to teach her a lesson during one of their jobs, Garrett steals the Claw, a grappling hook that Erin is particularly attached to. Shortly after, they arrive at the house of a baron, who is staging an event to withdraw the power from something called a primal stone, and is interrupted by the pair's brief conflict that destroys the glass-domed ceiling. Erin falls to her apparent death into the energy surge below, and the power of the stone brings the building down around them. Garrett is narrowly saved by throwing the Claw back up to the roof, embedding it in the Thief-Taker General's leg. but Erin is lost to the primal energy. Sometime later, Garrett awakes in the back of a cart being transported into the city by two unknown men. The guards approach and, for no real reason other than to start the game proper, kill the men and force Garrett to flee. This is where the first mission, Lockdown, begins. Upon traversing the streets and reaching his hideout in the old abandoned clock tower, Garrett finds that the city is rife with the gloom, a disease of the mind that warps those afflicted until they commit suicide, alongside a corrupt city guard preoccupied with keeping the city under control by any means necessary. He receives a message by Bird, Guinevere, to meet his favoured fence Basso, and sets off. Although Basso expresses disappointment at the year-long silence from Garrett, he tasks him with finding the ring of a recently deceased gent in an old foundry that the guard are now using to dispose of gloom-riddled citizens. There, Garrett comes across the thief-taker General again, now blessed by a limp where the claw speared his leg, and steals the ring from the General's own lockbox, fleeing the scene before the infuriated General can catch up. It is also here that Garrett experiences his first vision of Erin. Returning to Basso, Garrett is introduced to Orion, the leader of a revolutionary force called the Graven, who are intent on ridding the city of the General and the Guard's stranglehold. Orion requests that Garrett retrieve a seemingly innocuous book from the House of Blossoms, the local brothel. Before doing so, however, Garrett visits Erin's old hideout, where he finds a strange cipher she apparently left behind. He pockets it and makes his way to the brothel, where he fortuitously discovers that it was a damn good job he did take the cipher with him, as he needed it to help get the book from the rune-etched ancient library beneath the building. The ruins of the old city seem to be the remnants of the games that came before, but let's not dwell on that. As he escapes, Garrett is once again brought face to face with the General, who attempts to kill him and again fails. Garrett flees back to the clock tower. Sometime later, again, Garrett finds a mortally wounded Bird on his windowsill. Apparently taking this as a malign portent, he heads to Basso's hideout only to discover a flustered Orion searching for the brothel book. Orion informs him that Basso has been taken to the Keep, a stronghold for criminals, by the General. Somewhat reluctantly, Garrett hands over the book and sets off to rescue Basso. Along the way, he infiltrates the home of an architect, Eastwick, whereupon he entertains rumours of an apparently legendary vault as he searches for more information on a way into the Keep. After infiltrating the Keep and rescuing his fencing buddy, Garrett is tempted by the vault and goes out of his way to break in and steal the contents, after having his hand speared by an arrow from the General's crossbow. Inside the vault is a piece of the primal stone. Taking it gives him a vision of Erin, who tells him to go to Moira Asylum. At the asylum, Garrett learns that Erin was taken there after the incident with the primal energy and was experimented on and tortured in an effort to control the energy within her. Experimentation eventually resulted in the mutilation of several of the residents, who became eyeless, monstrous beasts, consumed with the need to hunt down the primal energy. Although Garrett finds no traces of Erin, he sees a vision of her time there that points him towards the barren Northcrest, and resolves to visit the Baron to find out more. Conversation with the very forthcoming Baron reveals that Orion is actually his illegitimate brother Aldous, and it is he who kidnapped Erin and tortured her, vision notwithstanding. The Baron states that the Primal is tearing apart the city, and there seems to be a piece of it within Garrett's eye. Below his manor, Garrett finds another shard, and after a brief tussle with the General yet again, escapes the building and returns to the city. At the clock tower, the Queen of Beggars, the woman responsible for healing the wounded Garrett over the past year, informs him that Erin was fused with the Primal and thus with the city, and in order to save them both, Garrett needs to conduct the ritual that Orion was intending to complete, albeit electing to take the less destructive path in the aftermath. At her behest, Garrett heads to the cathedral, where in its depths he confronts the General for a final time. Garrett can either face him head-on, ultimately killing him with the claw, or he can slip away and move on to the final mission of the game, Dawn's Light. Aboard the titular ship, Garrett finds Erin and watches her destroy Orion, before assembling the pieces of the Primal and extracting the source of energy from her. In the struggle, the pair of them wind up on the edge of the ship, poised to fall. Garrett throws her the claw but falls unconscious before he can view the result. When he awakes at dawn, the claw is beside him, and wet footprints on the nearby planks suggest that Erin survived. Now then, everything I've just said seems acceptable, right? It's not a bad story by any means. I mean, it's nothing spectacular and it's certainly a little devoid of imagination, but it's by no means the worst story in the universe. Right? You know what this game's problem is, aside from all the obvious ones? Pacing. Pacing, atmosphere, intrigue, character development, purpose, motivation, a reason to exist, common sense, self-awareness, poor dialogue, bland characters, an indistinct identity. Thief has a lot of problems. But the overwhelming majority of them stem from the fact that the story, and particularly the characters, very clearly have the least amount of effort put into them. It's all very well having a visually impressive game, but when you don't have the characters to back it up, players are not going to engage with the world. And Thief simply does not have anything more substantial than nice graphics and reasonably pleasing gameplay. The story lurches from point to point, with the missions held together by the thinnest of threadbare strands. Characters are incessantly bleak and miserable, there's no levity to the game beyond Garrett's occasional quips. When Genevieve dies, Basso expresses sadness, but it is literally the third time the player sees her. We've never been given a reason to care. When Orion turns out to be the Baron's brother, it's less of a shock and more of a, well, what a surprise moment. The General himself is perhaps the most egregious example. He is uncompromisingly unlikable to the point of hilarity. It genuinely feels like his character exists solely to give the player someone to work towards killing, so that by the time you do confront him and the game wants you to shoot a few arrows at him, you won't even bother trying to leave the room. And this is no more evident than in the fact that choosing to engage in combat with him results in a cutscene to conclude their relationship, whereas leaving the room just sends you on your merry way. But more than anything, the entire focal point of the game, more than this magical and mysterious primal energy, more than the thievery, and more than the revolution that is apparently going on in the background, is Erin. She is the keystone around which the entire foundation of this game is built. You are supposed to be finding her. You are supposed to be saving her. But right from the off, Thief makes it very clear that Garrett has no love for Erin, disapproving of her methods and her bloodlust. The game never, not once, tries to make Erin a likeable character. There are no backstories, no indications of why she became the way she did, no flashbacks to happier times or even brief monologues about how she wasn't always that way. The game gives you nothing but more fuel for the fire. And by the time the game is over, you care even less than you did to begin with. And there are so many unanswered questions. Why did Orion bother starting a revolution? As a distraction, it doesn't work since the Baron already knows what he's up to anyway. How on earth does the General keep turning up in the most random of places? Is he a ninja? Where did the gloom come from? And will it go now that the primal is gone? I'll be here all day if I keep this up. Now, don't get me wrong, there are notes spread about throughout the game that answer some of these questions, although not always without posing more. But what the game fails spectacularly to understand is that if you want a rich world, lore and characters, you have to show it, not stuff it away in the background where it can be easily missed. As a result, the one thing we are supposed to care about winds up becoming the desire to view the credits instead. So, what went wrong? At the heart of the matter is the fact that Thief just fails to understand its source material. It has no idea what it was about the previous games that people adored so much, and no real understanding of how it is that Thief, and Garrett himself, became influential legends. It is mechanically sound, but its compressed levels and linear, tight design, lack of options, lack of choices, lack of anything more substantial than waiting in a corner until you can swoop past a guard, means that replaying a level will always result in the exact same route you took the first time. It is poorly written, poorly acted, and poorly executed. But more than anything, Thief is jaded. It is an extreme example of an industry desperate to homogenize for the sake of appeal instead of innovate, reinvent, or excite. It is yet another dark, gloomy glimpse into a dark, gloomy world with a bland protagonist and an unlikable supporting cast. It has no freedom, no real exploration, and no comprehension of its own title. Thief is not a game about thievery, and it is not a game about Garrett and the city stumbling into mischief. It is a game about going to places and doing things so that you can go to more places and do more things. It is short, lonely, and dreary, easy, fruitless, and replayable only in the sense that the gameplay is pleasing. About the only thing Thief really, genuinely has going for it is the fact that it does play very well. It's unfortunate that this was the last gasp for breath in a series that was originally cut short by economy rather than inadvertent grave digging. I'm glad that Square Enix tried. For all the crap I've given this game, I do still enjoy playing it every so often as something short and mindless to sink some time into. And I guess what triggered the creation of this video was an attempt to understand why the game is so flawed, so unfinished, yet still compelling. What it comes down to stems not from what the game is, but what it isn't. Thief has all the workings of a great game, an idea, a theme, a strong foundation, an existing fanbase. It looks great, it plays well, and additional challenges like Iron Man and Master Difficulty increase replayability. I can see the glimmers of light within the darkness of Thief's jaded core, and I suspect that the developers really did try. But the game is weighted down by what it lacks rather than what it possesses. The transition to the 2010s have torn from it the very heart that made the Thief series what it is today, and left in its wake just a gaping hole surrounded by the tendrils of what could have been. And as they say, absence makes the heart grow fonder.